Hello and welcome. My name is Carol Carter and I'm the founder and CEO of GlobalMindED. And I welcome you today along with my co-host Celeste Gardner, who's here helping us with the technology and also works with Lisa Wyckoff. We are delighted to have as one of our featured speakers today, Dr. Ariel Ellis. And for those of you joining us earlier today and later this week, we're officially launching our 2020 GlobalMindED conference. It's our and we're obviously in COVID doing it virtually. So we appreciate your patience, your interest, and we have a lot of incredible inclusive leaders like Dr. Ellis, who you'll be from now and June 15th. So thank you so much for your interest, your patience, your inclusive leadership, and also for supporting so many of the first-gen students that we really want to fortify and be able to give strength to so that they can be all that they can be walking through this time period. So Dr. Ariel Ellis is a gifted strategist, a storyteller, and she is sought after for her culture, improve diversity, enhance communication, navigate community, and drive innovation. As a trainer and as a speaker, Ariel is in demand with audiences facing intergenerational, multicultural challenges, navigating differences, and maximizing productivity with 5 generations at work, and leveraging racial, ethnic identity as cultural capital. Organizations such as AIG, Assurion, Jackson National Life Insurance, Education Ministry, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, among others, have enlisted her expertise. She is the author of The Original Millennial, a book that highlights 6 defining lessons of leadership for millennials, accompanied by a professional development curriculum for millennial leaders facilitated in organizations across the country. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ariel Ellis. Thanks so much, Ariel. Great to see you.
Hi, Carol. Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into, can you all hear me really well? Just want to make sure there's no feedback. And I think we have all of the attendees on mute. So thank you again for being here. And I have to say that I'm grateful to Carol and Lisa and Celeste and that team for transitioning a full 2, 3, almost 4-day conference online virtually so that we could all participate. We would have been in Denver next month. Presenting and experiencing all there is to experience as it relates to this conference. And so I'm really grateful that the team was able to pull everything together virtually online. So thank you again and kudos to you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. As Carol said, my name is Dr. Ariel Ellis. I will be your virtual keynote speaker for the hour. I also am really appreciative that each of you joined today and elected to be a part of this particular portion of the conference. I'm grateful to have your attention, and I'm really excited about what we're going to learn together. Again, I want to thank Carol and the team for hosting me. I want to give a special shout out to Marta Newhart. Marta is the Chief Communication Officer at Westing Electric Corporation. She was at a corporation in Denver where GlobalMindED is based, and now she's recently appointed to this new role in Pittsburgh at Westinghouse. I'm sure you all are familiar with Westinghouse, and we probably had a appliance, Westinghouse appliance in our home at some point. But Marta is one of the top-ranking women of color in a Fortune 1000. She's also one of the top-ranking, actually, Latinas in the industry. In a high-ranking position, and she shared this opportunity with me to speak at GlobalMindED. So I want to give a special shout out to her, and I'm going to introduce to you the study shortly that Marta participated in. I think it's important to handle everyone or handle people with care. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you so that we can get started on today's presentation. But as I said, we're going to talk about intercultural competence and what you leaders have to learn about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I believe in handling people with care, and not only is it the right thing to do, it just shows competence in diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically when it's a priority or when it needs to be advanced in a conversation. As educators, we often say, You don't know, or people don't care how much you know unless they know how much you care, right? So I'd like to start off with a slight temperature check, as I do with many conversations and many trainings and many keynotes. We were not able to get the chat function going or the poll function going, but I want you to just type in the chat, how are you feeling? How are you feeling right now, mentally, emotionally, and physically? Number, we can put in 1 for awful, good, not good, rather 2, okay, 3, good, 4, or 5, great. And I'm just gonna eyeball it because I don't have the poll function, but I'm gonna eyeball it and just see, oh, so many of you feel great. I love it, I love it. And the honesty of that, I'm okay. Even if you all wanted to type a 2 or 1, that would be totally fine. It would be honest. It would show even your intercultural competency to really understand where you are and how you're feeling right now. Lots of 3s. That's so honest to be in the middle and to say, I'm okay. I'm not great. I'm not awful. I'm just okay. So thank you for sharing that. And later, I'm going to tell you why things like this are so important when it comes to intercultural competence. You know, there are a few things that leaders must do in order to make certain that diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, initiatives, plans, and programs are effective. And one in particular is to achieve intercultural competence. Now, leadership is about behaviors, as you all know. Leadership it can be one of the things that, as it relates to intercultural competence, it's the greatest thing that you can try to achieve, particularly when leaders are focused on understanding their role in valuing, seeking out, and leveraging differences. And leaders who understand their competence, their role from a level of competence, they know how to inform diversity inclusion strategies because they understand themselves. And they know that people need some very specific things before you attempt to practice diversity, equity, inclusion in a space with them. And those things include psychological safety, which is the comfort to express yourself, or open-mindedness, the space to share opinions and ideas, active listening, the belief that they will be heard, and transparency, the trust that they will be told the truth. Now, I want to say that this doesn't mean that a leader will involve everyone in everything or will include difference for the sake of difference, such as things like tokenism and pigeonholing. It means that they are strategically and holistically paying attention to every basic human element that are often overlooked, whether it's overtly or implicitly. And when we're attempting to practice diversity, equity, inclusion, which I'm gonna shorten as DEI, because that's a little bit of a mouthful. But as we're attempting to practice that, it means that these leaders are competent enough to be able to understand without that, with the absence of that, you're gonna miss a lot of main ingredients. We're going to look at today, what are those main ingredients of intercultural competence, why leaders need that, and what kind of training and education is necessary for leaders to practice DEI effectively. Feel free to follow me and share the conversation on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. You can jump in the chat and share your questions and comments at any moment. This is a little different than what we would do in person, but we're making the best of it, and we're still going to have some good experiences here. I want to try to get to as many of your comments and questions as possible, so feel free to type them in the chat. In fact, I'm going to try to manage the presentation in short form so that we can have a very rich discussion afterwards. First, to get started, I want you to think about all the times you've seen an organization get it wrong. You may even work for an organization who has gotten it wrong. And you might even say to yourself, surely they knew that was a bad move. Or this is what happens when there's no diversity at the table. I mean, we've all seen the headlines, and some headlines are more disappointing than others. We have probably seen the headlines that come from issues that were due to internal or perpetual nature of things, or internal nature of things that weren't necessarily newsworthy enough to actually make big news, yet we are full aware that they exist. So whether these issues are widespread or incidental, we know that these issues are related to organizational culture, and they don't just happen out of nowhere. They are key indicators of how diversity, equity, and inclusion is either thriving or lacking within an organization. And most importantly, how the outcomes of diversity, equity, inclusion impact stakeholders. And in the case of many of you who might be attending today as educators, those would be your students. So let's take a look at a few headlines, which we could probably predict the lack of intercultural competence as the root problem. Here's one. Automated vehicles are better at detecting pedestrians with lighter skin tones, making them more likely to hit Black people. Now, this is a result of racial biases that often are infused in our artificial intelligence, our AI systems. Do you remember even when we used to believe that technology was unbiased? But now we understand how the competence of technologists, if you will, technologicalists, people who make this technology, I got tongue-tied here, but the people who make technology, it's the reality here that some competence is missing. It has everything to do with the relevance, the relatability, and the usefulness that this technology has to multicultural audiences. The leaders behind this technology were clearly missing an element of intercultural competence in their decision-making. Here's another headline. Healthcare practices with medications and vaccines that have inequitable outcomes between men and women. Both genders are not offered equal quality treatment and care for the same medical complaints, or when different manifestations of a disease or illness are not considered based on gender, we can expect patient outcomes to differ. Now, we know there are studies upon studies upon studies documenting that this is an issue, and yet the disparity remains. This means that leaders in that industry are clearly overlooking the prioritization of intercultural competence in their approach to education, research, and training. And if we reference our current time and space in education, the challenges we're facing right now are beyond any one person or demographic. We've seen the frustration in the education sector for years, but recently around the abrupt stay-at-home orders across the US and of course the globe, hi Peter, and particularly though in the US, this global pandemic we are experiencing has put a spotlight on the lack of equity in education. Now, the lack of reliable internet access and technology is the first thing that we probably think of when it comes to education. But honestly, you all, this is only the tip of the iceberg. One of the things that we have to truly consider when it comes to education is the idea, I'm sorry, I skipped too far. One of the things we have to consider when it comes to intercultural competency, and as we face this global pandemic and what it relates to communication, we have to remember that some of our students have the responsibility of contributing financially to their family's livelihood. Some of our students are in communities of color where the coronavirus is sweeping rapidly. Some of our students are in traumatic home environments and they look to school as an escape. Some of our students are the only English speaker in the household and have to be the decision maker when it comes to big things. Or they're the only one in the household without a chronic illness and they have to be a caregiver. And amongst all of that, they're expected to continue to learn and thrive and pay attention and progress in their studies. And though no one could have predicted our present circumstances, it is clear that leaders in the education sector needed to rely on their intercultural competence to create a greater sense of urgency around student equity so that it would not take a global pandemic to show how all of our struggles are interconnected, and that leaders should be taking a more aggressive approach towards solutions. This means that if we jump to attempt to use diversity, equity, inclusion to fix these problems, we as leaders have to make sure that we're assessing our own knowledge, we're stretching our own understandings, and we're strengthening our own competence. And now that we know that intercultural competence has been taking a back seat, you may be saying, well, Ariel, what does intercultural competence actually look like in leadership and how do I achieve it? So it's important for me as an educator and as a communicator to define the terms. For the sake of our time together today, intercultural as a definition just simply means various ways of life, all right? So think about intercultural as simply meaning various ways of life and how we experience those various ways of life and how they merge and intersect. Competence, for the most part, we understand what the word competence means, but for the sake of today's talk, we want to define it as simply a level of understanding. We know that competence can be elusive and very hard to pin down. What feels like competence to one person, once assessed, could feel like incompetence to someone else. This is why leaders have training and education in place in order to pursue and push diversity, equity, and inclusion. Many leaders have recognized the need to ensure that their organizations reflect diverse communities and the diverse communities that it serves. And many times there's just a general expectation that leaders will know what to do and how to do it. This is no less true in the education sector. It is undisputed that successful education institutions and even corporations who are responsive to their constituents often reflect their needs and wants. Therefore, we have to make an effort to know what students and constituents need and respond to those needs. We also know that as communities change, and we know that now more than ever, we know that as communities change, there are public, private, and nonprofit organizations that are stretching as much as they can to respond to the needs of these communities. They're finding very innovative ways to provide services to increasingly diverse populations, and they're being very respectful and attentive to these cultural beliefs and traditions. So I want to be really clear as we talk about intercultural competence. It is not affirmative action or multiculturalism or just simply relegated to diversity training or equal employment opportunity, or even political correctness. All of those things in some way, somehow increase statistical diversity. And they're facets of intercultural competence, don't get me wrong. But this concept we're talking about today is a much broader concept that begins with a dominant culture, whether we're speaking by race or rank. This dominant culture, if you will, in some cases, kind of folks like us based on the situation, becoming more self-aware about our own customs, our own norms, our own nuances, and our own privileges, and then being responsive to and understanding those cultural differences of other people inside of a system. I hope that makes sense. I went professor on you for a little while. It's okay. All right. So I want to present to you some details of a study that I conducted with some of my colleagues and give you some insight on what leaders had to say about how intercultural competence influences and improves even ultimately, or could improve their practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what did we do? In this study, we wanted to find out what kind of intercultural competence do leaders need to practice diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what kind of training and education is needed to ensure competency? As we said, competency is aloof, so it's kind of difficult to make sure you have it or not. So we wanted to find that out. We conducted a mixed methods study, including an online survey of 10 questions. We distributed it to 152 leaders and multinational companies. Each of these leaders had 10 to 15 years minimum experience in a leadership position. They also had the task of designing, communicating, implementing, and executing diversity, equity, inclusion practices. We then interviewed 12 of those leaders so that we could gain deeper and more personal insights. And we know, for the most part, that leaders in these positions have a couple of things. They have the influence to establish organizational culture. They often have the final say and are highly influential on strategic and budgetary decisions. And they support, sponsor, or approve training, education, and professional development in the area of diversity and inclusion for their employees. So it was very important that we were, and I'm going to say a cliche I hate, pick their brain. I don't like that, but we wanted to pick their brain to find out what does it take to improve, or what kind of intercultural competency do leaders need to practice diversity and inclusion effectively, and how do they get the appropriate training and education? The results were interesting. 41% of the respondents had only practiced diversity and inclusion in their present roles for 5 years or less. All of the respondents, however, had participated in some kind of training or workshop as it related to diversity and inclusion that their current or their former employee provided. More than half of them, a significant amount, have been exposed to trainings and workshops through organizations like GlobalMindED, conferences, consulting firms, expert trainers, etc. Over half of them felt very confident in their perceived level of intercultural competence. Again, as I said earlier, competence is subjective. So majority of them felt really confident in their level of intercultural competence. And a huge 82% of them agreed that leaders who are charged with practicing diversity, equity, inclusion as a job function must receive the appropriate training to improve and increase their intercultural competency. So the goal here was to figure out, we know that leaders care about intercultural competency and think it's a key element to practicing DEI effectively. Well, which elements or which segments of intercultural competence were most important to them and could serve as a model for training and educating leaders? We gave them 5 segments: intercultural communication, intercultural sensitivity, intercultural awareness, intercultural research, and intercultural experiences. All the respondents ranked communication and sensitivity the highest, awareness came closely behind, and then research ranked in 4th. You might be surprised to know that intercultural experiences were not identified as an area of priority. It seemed as if that particular category for the leaders who responded to our study felt that intercultural experiences would indirectly fold into the other areas as a result or an outcome. So intercultural experiences, unfortunately, were not significantly ranked. So that as we looked at the top 4, we realized why the leaders felt that intercultural competency was the greatest need for leaders who are going to practice DEI and what training was needed. We also noticed that the competencies were prioritized based on knowledge and procedures needed to practice diversity and inclusion. And the idea, here's something that was significant, the idea that in each segment, the leader is going to be operating in 2 ways: effectively and appropriately. Effectively meaning, again, effectively measuring by this particular person's competence. Effective meaning when the leader accomplishes his or her goal for the organization. That makes it effective. What makes it appropriate? Appropriate is when the social context that this leader is operating within is accepted and expected. Right? So we had to define what it meant for each of these segments to be ranked and for the leader to know whether or not they were doing it effectively or appropriately. So let's take a look at each of them. Communication ranked at the top at 82. Now, this element of intercultural competence included a verbal exchange of ideas and messages through language. It included listening to the context of diversity and inclusion, eye contact, knowing whether to make eye contact, knowing whether to shake hands, knowing whether to bow in various cultural contexts, knowing how to communicate not only verbally, but non-verbally. And then once you learn that information, how do you adapt? The second, coming in at 80%, the leaders ranked intercultural sensitivity as second. Now, intercultural sensitivity involved the willingness to know and appreciate cultural differences. Primarily, it would be concerned with emotions and feelings about intercultural differences and intercultural feelings, and the willingness to modify your behavior out of respect for someone who's different than you. The biggest element of intercultural sensitivity that the leaders ranked was empathy. Again, being able to modify or being able to understand someone who might be different. Number 3, the competence that ranked 3rd was intercultural awareness. This was very close at 79%. Now, intercultural awareness was unpacked as this understanding of cultural practices that influence how an individual behaves and also how they interpret behavior. It involved the knowledge of people, having a real true knowledge of people and the skills to understand them. This was important too about intercultural awareness, is that it meant that the leader was able to gather information and gain knowledge so that as assertions and resolutions and solutions were expressed, even if it was done with good intention, it didn't always translate in behavior. And that leader was vulnerable enough and transparent enough to keep an open mind. Lastly, intercultural research. Now you might say, okay, where does this really fit in? The research piece is extremely important. And I want you to swap out the word research for even intercultural curiosity or intercultural inquiry, right? Thinking about research and just being curious. This included that macro level of areas such as political systems and economic development, societal factors, understanding what those societal factors are. And if you don't understand them, knowing how to go get the information, knowing how to go find out what the differences are from various zip codes where your students are, or knowing where to find information or how to find information, and learning and recall facts that make a distinction in how people live and shop and what schools they go to, how they spend their money, knowing how to, and being curious enough to go get that data so that you could detect patterns of behavior. What was significant about the intercultural research or the curiosity piece was that the ability to be able to fact find was critical so that these leaders could avoid assumptions and avoid mistargeting and develop policies, practices, and solutions that really help the people that they serve. So those were our 4. Now let's take a look at some of the comments of the leaders who participated in this study and how they felt this set of intercultural competencies could be integrated in training. So as you notice here, I got a couple of quotes popped out, and one of the key things was, I'll read one for you here. The one in the top left here, I think it's trying to, and this is in response to improving and growing competence. I think it's important to develop my skills individually as an ally and always continue to learn about diversity and inclusion in leading by example. So this person was very very serious about leading by example, as many of the respondents were. We saw a theme also of many of the leaders who came from backgrounds where they identified as a person of color, maybe they identified LGBTQ. Many of them who had some very significant intersectional type experiences, intersectional backgrounds. They had a lot to say in how they really weighed those experiences heavy and how they made decisions. They were constantly referring to their own race, their own gender, their own religion, their own sexual identity as the key thing that was informing them and improving their competence and how they were making their intercultural competence a priority. The leaders were also very serious about saying that training was needed and conversations were needed, and how their organizations were providing resources, but that they would even outside of their organization, like many of you, pursue training outside. Many of them were very serious about not producing diversity inclusion out of a compliance mechanism, but doing it out of a business imperative as well as a social responsibility imperative, which, as we know, social responsibility ties directly to business imperatives as well. So these leaders were very outspoken. They overall were not fully satisfied with the experiences that they had had within their organizations and were committed to making change. So what are the next steps? How do you navigate this thing as a leader? I think the data is very clear to show that intercultural competence is something that is ongoing. The issues that we face are systemic, and that there's training and education that needs to be designed to fill, eliminate, or further expose the gaps that we've seen. So what do we need? We need more evidence-based training and assessment procedures that could improve on practices of diversity and inclusion. We need data and evidence of the outcomes. When organizations have accumulated more experience in intercultural competence, we need evidence of that. We also need equitable policies and procedures that are going to trace right back to training and education. And you might say, okay, Ariel, that's great. How do I make it practical? Here we go. When you are pursuing training or education for yourself or for the organizations that you work for or your teams, identify offerings and materials that go beyond the surface. Most organizations are going to want to start with implicit bias. That's a great go-to. It is an excellent start, and it is certainly of importance, but it cannot be a solo conversation. More education needs to be around specific multicultural groups, behaviors, identity, etc., and not just kind of lumping everyone into one category and presuming that implicit bias is the one-stop shop. Speaking of a one-stop shop, when you are pursuing training and education, you have to commit to a series of learnings. You cannot have a one-shot deal, a workshop or a guest speaker, an event, or even a conference. That one experience is not sufficient enough in providing you with the kind of competence you need for today's problems. You must invest, your organization must invest in more long-term programming so that you can yield better results. When you're pursuing training and education, train the trainer if you intend to do it in-house. This might sound like a no-brainer, but I get many calls from employees who have been asked to develop a curriculum or strategic plan for diversity, equity, inclusion, and they themselves have had no training and no education. If you believe that someone in your organization has the skills and the talents to produce diversity, equity, inclusion programming, please give them the formal skills and the formal resources to be successful at it. And when you're pursuing training and education, please don't leave anyone out. This also may sound like a no-brainer, but I promise you it's not. Organizational culture cannot shift, and the DEI efforts cannot be effective if leaders themselves are not educated. A lot of times our mid-level managers are often carrying the load, and some functional teams like IT and finance are often left out for the assumption that people with front-facing roles need the most intercultural competence. And when it comes to intercultural competence, we naturally have some level of it, but it means that when training is considered, no one should be left out. Because intercultural competence is highly relevant in business and management situations, it is important to better understand intercultural competence in leaders and in ourselves. So beyond the research, beyond the data, beyond the strategy, there is one thing that we all can do to improve our intercultural competence if we are to be effective in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that is to be human. The top 4 competencies that I presented to you today, communication, sensitivity, awareness, and research, they're all aspects of human behavior, all things that we need, all things that we practice, all things that we desire. And I hope today, as we think about our intercultural competency, we will focus on being human. I hope that each of you will commit to pursuing each of these competencies as you pursue and achieve a greater sense of intercultural competence for yourself and allow it to influence and improve your approach to diversity, equity, inclusion. If you need additional resources, you can visit my website, Advisory 83, you connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'd love to chat with you further. So let's talk. Questions? I'm going to go to the chat box real quick. I don't see any questions, but I see Lakita Stribling saying, yes, DEI can't be pushed up an organization. It is too heavy a lift. Yes.
And Ariel, while people are putting their questions in, I wanted to also share, I don't know if you all get our newsletter, but we had an interview on Saturday with Dr. Pamela Newkirk, who wrote that book, Diversity, Inc., exposing the billions of dollars that people have spent, last couple decades on diversity and inclusion trainings that really have not, moved that needle. So just to get people in their inquisitive mode to put in the chat, I just wondered if you wanted to respond to that as well.
Sure. I think, we definitely have to be able to refer to as many resources as possible. There are so many experts in this area, and many folks have been talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion for a very long time. But one of the things that we have kind of overlooked is marrying diversity, equity, inclusion with the intercultural competency of the people who are practicing it. As I said before, we see a lot of the headlines where organizations are just fumbling and not really doing a great job. And even some of the organizations that are doing a great job, they don't get a lot of, publicity for the work that they're doing, or a lot of recognition for the work that they're doing, acknowledgement. And some, you think they're doing a good job, But if you ask some of their employees, they say, no, we're not doing a great job at this.
Right.
I don't feel as I said earlier, I don't feel psychologically safe. I don't feel like active listening I don't feel like I'm heard. I don't feel like there's an open-minded culture, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of smoke and mirrors when we start to think about diversity, equity, inclusion in today's more multicultural society. It becomes a thing where, the acronym is just it's a buzzword, right? So it means that if we train leaders and leaders really focus on their own individual intercultural competency, then that's always going to be at the forefront. And you're thinking about that before you just pick up a book. You're thinking about that before you pursue a workshop or training. You're going to conferences, but you're also layering your resources and paying attention to how you show up as a leader. I see a question Carol, should I call out the questions or you want to call them out?
Sure. Well, you know what? Here, this is from Lakita. She says, yes, I often say D&I can't be pushed up an organization. The lift is too heavy. Again, yes, I found that if you don't touch a person's heart, the D&I conversation will never register at the head. And I think that is true, like the leadership. And also, let's just say we got to get more women and people of color and diverse people on the boards of these organizations because they're largely Caucasian male. And that is a factor of many factors, but that's one of the factors. And we've got to get C-suite, board, all those things.
And I can speak to that briefly before we go to the next question. I do serve on the board of a corporation, and I am the youngest person to be on that board. And I am the only African-American woman to be on that board. And it is a heavy lift. I'll say that. So I bring all of me and all of my knowledge and resources and my energy and the things that I care about to this board. But if I'm not using my intercultural competence to interact with everyone else who doesn't look and interact like I do, as well as thinking about other people who look like I do and other people who come from where I come from and saying, hey, how can I expose you to the rest of these folks? Then it becomes the lack of DEI on those boards just becomes cyclical. And yes, we are needed, but it still can be an uphill battle, and even in those cases.
And then Shannon asked, are there any training resources you can recommend, in particular conferences and workshops?
Sure, you're at one of the best one right now, best conferences. I definitely think that, of course, you can go to my website, advisory83.com, and learn more about what we do. But there are, a lot of organizations rely on the IDI test to be able to test, to assess their leaders' intercultural competency. There are many measurement tools that exist out there. I don't want to just throw some out that I think you should take advantage of. What I want to do, though, is to tell you what are the key things you should look for, right? I don't want to name drop. I want to tell you some of the key things that you should look for, which is what I just shared in the presentation. Implicit bias is great. You definitely need that, but you also need to understand intergenerational issues, and you need to understand, things as it relates to the veteran community and the differently able community, and specifically when it comes to communities, how diversity inclusion actually impacts the bottom line of an organization, right? So I don't have any specific workshops and conferences and events that you should pay attention to, but I think just be, as I said earlier, about the intercultural research, try to be curious about a little bit of all of it. And I think it's important to just mix and match as many of the elements as you can so that you can have a very well-rounded level of intercultural competence.
Mm-hmm. And then Lakita had a follow-up, which is, what are the best practices with having white men understand D&I includes them too?
Yeah. Oh, that's so
no
good.
one group can solve it with just like women can't solve it for women.
No, absolutely. At some point, those who might classify in what some may say a marginalized, group, or those who have a variety of different type of intersections, at some point you get tired. And there's a lot of labor in trying to carry the load of changing an organization and impacting culture. And what I think needs to happen, particularly when it comes to what I'll give you what I've experienced with my white male colleagues and the organizations that I've worked with, as well as the ones that I've worked for, and even the boards that I sit on, is that they have to care, right? And identifying ways that give them an opportunity to care. Here's what's uncomfortable about that, is you can't make someone care, right? They have to ultimately care and be able to see the benefit. And because we know that white men are generally in positions of leadership at the top, it could be understanding what brings their bell, right? What makes them curious? What makes them interested? What would motivate them? Is it numbers? Well, how do we connect? How do we develop storytelling that would, make them curious enough to want to find out how diversity and inclusion can lead to innovation, right? What do we do with that? Again, there's some labor for those of us who get it, right? There's some labor involved for us, those of us who get it, and that's why I say, it's a difficult thing to balance, because you don't want to always have to make someone care, but you at least have to know what motivates them, right? What motivates them enough? What story can be told? What numbers can be shown? What narrative can be developed to present to these individuals to give them a sense of interest in investing in these programs, in investing in various audiences that they've never invested in before, in placing a person of color or a woman on the board. They've got to care. And that's where that intercultural competency comes in, particularly the communication, because you got to start to know what makes a person tick in order for them to care.
Yeah. Here's another one from Sean Chisholm. He says, how do you balance creating a quote safe space with challenging folks to engage in brave, forward-thinking discussions? And I'll just say, and actions and commitments. Sometimes it feels like the trainings are simply something that we quote have to do.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I agree.
Get the deliverables. How do the big levers move? It's not just that you're pointing at the issue.
Yeah, I agree. First of all, I thank you, Sean, because creating a safe space is overlooked oftentimes. And I think what I attempted to do with you all, thank you for saying that, because what I attempted to do with you all in the beginning by asking you how you were feeling is an opportunity for us to create a safe space together. Just a small attempt over Zoom, right? To create a safe space. Even when you have individuals who may not, you don't always feel safe, right? I think it kind of goes back to those 4 things I mentioned: psychological safety, open-mindedness, active listening, transparency. You've got to start with that, because you're right. You do have to have brave conversations. You do have to engage in forward-thinking conversations and discussions. And the trainings can feel like a checkbox. I think one of the things that is important to avoid that is to ensure that the leaders, again, we're talking about leaders, that leaders at the top, and whether it comes from, it's pushed through the leaders that are mid-level or folks who are rising up the ranks, it's important to let them know, or to figure out ways to make sure that diversity, equity, inclusion, and I'm going to say a phrase I don't like, is baked into the culture. And the desire is for it to be baked into the culture. Because if we're doing something because we're in a crisis, or we're doing something to avoid being in trouble, or we're doing something to satisfy one particular demographic, it's always going to backfire. We have to really care about what we're doing and the why. We have to know, I like to say this all the time, you have to know your why. And if an organization doesn't know their why, then they're going to do a training and check the box. They're going to send an employee to a workshop or two just to say, we sent Karen to that workshop, right? So it takes time. It's not an overnight thing. And it's going to be various elements and various moving parts to really not only create safe spaces within our organization, which again, as I say, comes from the top, but it's also going to take some very strategic planning and moving things around to make sure that trainings aren't just a thing that we have to do.
Awesome.
I hope that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. I'm just going to say too, because I'm big on like accountability and deliverables. What if trainers, when they're working with these different corporations, at the same time they're working with people who are maybe entry-level, mid-level managers, are able to also, you know, set some specific goals with the C-suite folks and say, over the next year, what are the specific things you're willing to make a commitment to? And by the way, I think university presidents, same thing. Super homogenous culture in the leadership. And how do we get our first gen students that we help at GlobalMindED, how do we get them to the table? Because they need to co-create the solutions with that faculty, you know, the faculty that's in the leadership role. So how can the trainers and the people just get to that higher level of what are your deliverables and start to really work by deliverables for the next year?
Do you mean that folks who are going into organizations, making sure that they hold those leaders accountable?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which I know is hard because, you know, you're the person that is often being brought in by them. But I also think we just got to be a little bit more bold and, you know, forthright. But here's another question. Let's say this is one from, okay, Candace is saying, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Ellis. Great perspective about ensuring that leadership sets the tone on training. And then Ansley Glenn said, I'm a white female educator at a school that is primarily white, lacks diversity overall. My school has historically had a difficult time retaining students and faculty of color. We have a long way to go in the area of D&I. What advice could you give us about steps that I as an ally can do to help impact the community? What are some of the beginning steps that we at a school can do to move in the right direction? And Ansley, thank you so much for caring about being here today and just being such an ally for all of us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ansley. That's an amazing question. And I'm always just motivated when I get questions like that. There's a difference between being welcomed and feeling that you belong. Many times in predominantly white spaces, students and people of color will feel tolerated, that we just kind of, you're welcome to come if you want to, right? That's the nature of the feeling sometimes. And it seems as though those around us who don't identify as a person of color, because there may be some intercultural competence that they lack in that area, or some personal experience that they lack, they may not feel it. And they don't know what it's like to be othered, quote unquote. So it's very obvious sometimes when an organization cannot retain students and faculty of color, that those folks that do come, they feel welcomed, but they do not feel like they belong. Your organization has to develop a culture that lets students and faculty know that you belong here. This community is not just ours and we're leasing it to you for the time that you want to come on campus. You're one of us, right? So again, it goes back to the intercultural competency in you, Ansley, and the rest of your colleagues who are allies to say, what can we do? And you might have to ask your faculty and students of color personally. I mean, this is important. So ask them, what does it take for you to feel like you belong here, that this community is yours, right? That's the only way that they're going to want to stay. They got to feel like the community belongs to them.
Yeah. Thank you. Here's a follow-up from Lakita. She says, I'm starting to see the pendulum swing to organizations with all white females in the C-suite laud themselves for success with D&I. Yeah, I've seen that too, where a lot of people look at D&I as gender-based. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think this is heavy to unpack, Lakita.
Good, that makes it an awesome question.
Yep, it does.
5-star question.
This is one of the, as I've studied and have worked in this space as a communicator and into this space and as an educator in this space, there is definitely a fear of diversity, equity, inclusion being perpetuated to exclude people who benefit from it most, right? And there's also this very real concern that because of how race dominates our world in so many ways, that some of the things that we have unfortunately experienced with the lack of intercultural competency with white men will be repeated with white women. And so that's a very real fear. And I think that I don't have solutions to that, but I do think that it's something that needs to be called out, that when we go back and think about the sameness of if we were to say, what's the difference, you know, between an all-white male C-suite and an all-white female C-suite? Would we really see a whole lot of difference other than the assets that come from difference in gender? Now, if an organization is overlooking what those assets are, and again, as Carol said, you're not tracking what those assets are, then we probably need to ask some questions. But I too have seen that, and that's something that I think hopefully somebody on this call, I'd be glad to partner with you to do a study on the increase of all white female C-suites and what that means, and if it has the potential, which statistically we would say that it does, we could say that it does, how that has an impact to negatively change what diversity inclusion looks like, the success of it, and how it's practiced. That's a great question, and it sounds like another panel discussion. It sounds like a panel discussion. Carol, I hope you consider that.
This is where, if we were all live, you guys would be having dinner with a subsection of the people in your session tonight.
But I also think
we will be doing that.
Can I add real quick, Carol, that
sure,
you know, when it comes to gender, I think it's so much easier to talk about gender than race or anything other than that. So it's easier to say, oh, let's put a woman in, right? Well, let's put another woman in. This one woman, she did so great, or she's doing well, or she's winning in this particular area. Let's put another one in. And then let's put another one in, and she's going to bring somebody, and she's going to bring somebody, right? And so that, you know, while we may not be able to fault that mindset, we also will be able to say, well, wait a minute, if we're going to talk about women and we want more women to be in, then we should want more women of color to be in, right? Because if gender is across the board, let's let gender be across the board. So we have to call stuff like that out.
I agree. And I think another thing that people don't talk about very much is the whole thing of people from privilege and cliques of privilege and power. And some of that can be the Ivy League institutions. You know, my family lost all our money when I was in 5th grade. So, and I had 4 older brothers and 5 male cousins. So I relate to people who are raised with no money and all male environment. Mm-hmm. But I don't hear us talking enough about how do we get more people who went to a state school or a community college, or they didn't even get a college degree, onto the boards or into these different positions, who have done amazing things, or, you know, there's so many rich ways that people from different backgrounds involved. And I think we're still having a very limited discussion about where those diverse talent sources can even come from.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is so due to, you know, just the nature of our society and the reality that we carry privilege in so many different ways, and how that perceived privilege, or how that perceived privilege can be converted into perceived value, right? If I have a certain amount of privilege, then I must be more valuable than the person who doesn't have it. And so that's a thought process that I believe the intercultural competence can change, because with that exposure, we start to see that no one is truly more valuable than the other based on the spaces that we're in.
Absolutely. And it looks like Nicole just made just a quick comment saying that in her experience, gender is the intention for leaders to change, but she feels like women of color are left out of that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I just feel like we got to hold everybody to much higher standards. And this is one of the reasons we have those inclusive leader awards. We feel like, you know what, until the diverse leaders, the sports stars and the movie stars, we're not going to have the people who know who the role models are running the Fortune 100 or 500 companies or in government, because we don't have those role models, just like first gen need the role models.
Yeah. And I think, you know, just as a final takeaway, you know, and I love to say be human. I love that. I always end a lot of my trainings in conversations with being human. And for the most part, you know, that may sound similar, or that may sound like something that everyone can do, but it's something that everyone is going to do differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that is so critical. And again, when we think about intercultural competency, it really starts with self.
Mm-hmm.
And it really starts with digging out, how am I communicating? Do I have enough empathy? Am I aware of the differences around me? And am I curious enough to find out the things that I don't know?
Ariel, I think you've been amazing. And I just want to say, for the people that have been part of this, I think that you all with Ariel should just form your own fantastic equity team. And next year when we're live in 2021 in Denver, I just think this is what's so powerful about Global Minded is people just meet different people from different segments, and they get together and they can get way bigger things done than they would from just the silo that they spend most of their time in. So I just want to say, Ariel, amazing job, but also just what great people. And Linda's asking, can we get to the link? Yes. So Global Minded 2020 has a YouTube channel. So Ariel's session will be on that YouTube channel, and God willing, Celeste will be able to maybe put it up there even tonight. But that's where people are sharing this with their classrooms, with their students, you know, in a much wider way. So that will be up there. And then I just want to also share that all week we've got some really wonderful people like Ariel on some different topics. Tomorrow, Dr. Terrell Strayhorn is doing a session on how a sense of belonging creates competitive advantage, why schools and businesses should care. And then we've got a really wonderful group of people, a first-gen role model, Dr. Angie Pancioni, who graduated from Stanford and is the head of Colorado's Department of Higher Education, and with Alicia Kerr, who runs college track regionally. She's wonderful. She was also first-gen in New York City and was the first African-American woman to rise within TIAA. And another woman, Therese Avankovich, with them. And then we've got a session from ACU called Intentionally Developing Faculty to Close the Achievement Gaps. And let's see, we've got one more thing here. I'm pulling it all up on my iPad, you guys. We've got a session with some of the folks from Ascendium Education on looking at the ways in which higher education can foster the prison to professional pipeline access and success. So that's going to be on Friday. Adrian Rosado on setting the standard for Latino leadership in higher education and beyond. And then Dr. Crystal Rose, who many of you know from Aussie Media, one of our partners, she's leading a session Friday afternoon called Post-Pandemic Models in Higher Education. And she's got a whole group of college presidents of color. So if you've got first-gen students and you want them to see some amazing people that they can be someday, you know, we definitely have so many awesome people like Ariel in this community. So just want to give a big round of applause to Ariel, our virtual round of applause, and then just thanking each of you. You've got a million things going on, but just thank you guys so much for making the time. And I look forward to seeing all of you in person next June. And maybe we come in early and we do a pre-conference on this topic with each of you. But I know that you all are the leaders that can change all of this. So thanks again, Ariel.
Thank you.
And we've got Ariel's contact information in the chat feature. And looking forward to great things from all of you. So thanks for the inclusive leaders that you all are.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, everyone.
You bet. Bye-bye.